Government information is the backbone of an open society. It enables accountability, supports research, and it empowers citizens to participate in democracy. But today, much of that record is at risk. As more government information is published digitally, gaps in preservation are growing. Access is becoming more fragile, and vital materials can vanish with an executive order or the click of a button. If the public record can vanish overnight, what does that mean for transparency, history, and even democracy itself? Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Freeland, and I'm a librarian at the Internet Archive. I want to welcome you to our book talk. Today, we'll be discussing Preserving Government Information, Past, Present, and Future by, get ready for this, my favorite author duo of all time, James A. Jacobs and James R. Jacobs. Their book is a timely exploration of how preservation practices of the past shape today's challenges and what we must do to ensure the future. Our conversation will be led by librarian Shari Laster. As we get started here today, I would like to welcome Brewster Kahle, the Internet Archive's founder and digital librarian, to the screen. And I know that Brewster has a lot of passion about government documents and government information these days. So I'd love to welcome Brewster and turn it over to him. Are you there, Brewster?
Thank you very much for James and Jim for writing a tome that we have already started to mass read at the Internet Archive because of the Democracy's Library project, which kicked off a couple years ago to try to get all documents from the all of the democracies available in bulk and in new services to go and help inform a population that's really trying to understand what the world looks like. The democracies need to have an educated populace, and so they tend to publish openly. But a lot of these documents are not available. It's surprising that the public domain is often not very publicly accessible. So let's change that. And the guidance that you guys, by having deep knowledge of the whole area of government documents in the United States, and it's going, Democracy's Library is also going on in Canada. How can we spread this out as a worldwide movement? And your leadership in documenting the importance of this whole thing is critical. So thank you very much for writing the book and coming here to speak about it.
Thanks, Brewster. I want to acknowledge all the folks, the love and support shown from Stanford here in the chat. So thanks everyone from Stanford and all the other librarians and everyone else who's tuned in here today on what's sure to be a really good and fascinating conversation, and timely as well. So here to introduce our speakers and to set the stage for the rest of today's discussion is Dave Hansen, the Executive Director of Authors Alliance. Over to you, Dave.
Thanks, Chris. And thank you, James and Jim, for doing this talk with us today. So, from my perspective, government information is one of the most critical research pieces of research information that the authors that I work with rely on. I mean, it's really kind of a fascinating thing to look across the range of authors, from historians to people in education to people in law, that are so dependent on access to government information, and having some reassurance that the information that they're accessing is preserved in a way that maintains its integrity. And so, I'm really excited for this talk. And I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers and then get out of the way so we can hand it over to them. So first I want to introduce James Jacobs, who's the U.S. Government Information Librarian at Stanford University Libraries, where he supports the research needs of the university and works on both traditional web collection, traditional collection development, as well as digital projects like LOCKSS US Docs. So among other things, he is the co-founder of Free Government Information, FreeGovInfo.info, which I hope makes its way into the chat as a link for you all to check out. I'm also pleased to introduce Jim Jacobs, Librarian Emeritus from UC San Diego, where he served as the Data Services Librarian from 1985 to 2006. He has served as a technical consultant to the Center for Research Libraries in their audits and certifications of the trusted digital repositories of HathiTrust, Portico, and Locks, which is pretty cool and some pretty technical stuff. And he is also co-founder of FreeGovInfo.info. So in conversation with James and Jim today, we have Sherry Laster, who is the head of open collections, curation, and access at Arizona State University Library. In addition to prior experience as a government information librarian, Sherry is past chair of the Depository Library Council, which is the advisory body for FDLP, and past chair of ALA's Government Docs Roundtable. So I am going to turn it over to you three, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Do you want to start, Jim?
I will start. I'm Jim.
Hi, everyone. I'm James. Thanks,
Um,
Brewster and Dave and Chris for inviting us to speak today.
Yeah, thank you so much to the Internet Archive. This book literally could not have been written without the resources of the Internet Archive. We want to begin with a very simple example of government information, and that's the food pyramid, which probably many of you have seen before. The Department of Agriculture has been giving nutritional advice to consumers since at least the 40s when there was food rationing. And in 1990, they adopted an illustration of a pyramid to suggest different quantities of food and categories of food for a balanced diet. It's changed these illustrations over the year. Today, it's not even a pyramid anymore. It's a plate. Its advice has changed over the years about what good nutrition is and what different categories of foods you should eat in what quantities. But the record of those different government suggestions and advice is the history of our government. Preserving government information is about preserving all those different recommendations so that we can have a record of government activities. It's also about ensuring that the information that's created and collected and produced by the government is not erased or altered. And it's also about, although this food pyramid is a trivial example, the principle remains the same for laws, reports, and irreplaceable information that the government gathers through censuses and surveys. James?
Yeah. So we imagine that a number of folks here today, I'm so glad to see 142. That's pretty amazing. Have tuned in because they've become aware that the current Trump administration has been altering, withdrawing, and deleting government information, not to mention federal employees and entire agencies, and doing so at a frightening scale and pace. There are a lot of excellent examples of projects that are addressing this complex and enormous problem that we're talking about in our book, about the loss and the preservation of government information. And you can find a list of them at the datarescueproject.org website. They have a whole list of sort of a running list of projects that are currently active. And needless to say, the Internet Archive is central to the success of many of these projects, including one that's close to my heart, the End of Term Archive, which the Internet Archive is an active participant. These projects are all working to rescue specific publications, specific titles, specific websites, and specific data sets. But one of the problems that these kinds of rescue efforts face is that there is no list of what the government has published or altered or withdrawn. There's no denominator out there that we know of. We've tried to get a little bit closer in our book, but there's not really one number. And there's no list of what has already been preserved and protected against loss. There's not even a common agreement about what constitutes successful preservation. So without preservation infrastructure, preservationists like Jim and myself and Sherry and lots of other people are essentially working in the dark.
So what we're trying to do with our book is provide a context for all of this. And we do that by doing three things which we don't think anyone else has done before. The first thing is we analyzed a ton of data so that we could get that denominator that James mentioned, characterize the government, what the government is publishing digitally. We quantify what's being published, by which branches of government, and we try and describe the kinds of information they're producing. It's important to characterize the different kinds because government information includes everything from unique archival records to widely distributed publications like the congressional record to databases and raw data.
As well as puzzles and weird stuff like that.
Weird stuff, maps. We also analyze preservation data to characterize what the government is preserving. That gives us the numerator, and we can contrast those two numbers and find out what the gap is in government preservation. James?
The second thing that we're doing in this book is we're examining why these gaps exist. We do this by looking at the preservation laws and the regulations and the policies, projects and activities in both the paper era, when government information was published in paper and ink books and distributed to FDLP libraries around the country, and now in the digital era, where virtually all government publications are posted as digital files on the web. This lets us pinpoint which preservation practices have worked and which have not worked, and why. For example, one of the big causes of those preservation gaps in the digital age is the use of what we think of as paper era preservation techniques that simply don't work or don't scale in the digital age. Jim?
The third thing we do is to define the elements needed for new digital preservation infrastructure, or DPI. We use those elements to suggest a framework for building an infrastructure, and we use that framework to provide a vision of how a successful DPI might work on the day-to-day level. Finally, we suggest the steps preservationists can take today to start creating and preserving information. If the preservation community, in which we include government agencies, but also non-government libraries and archives, work together toward a common goal of preserving government information, we won't find ourselves again having to rescue information as it is being deleted. Instead, we will preserve it as it is being published and protect it from alteration and erasure. The goal of a successful digital preservation infrastructure will be to preserve a record of changing government policies, not implement those policies by altering or erasing old information. And that's the end of our short presentation. I think, Sherry, are you taking over now?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Jim. And hi, everybody. Really excited to be here today to talk with James and Jim. So just a little bit of context from my perspective, because I'm super interested in long-term public access to government information. I probably would have considered this book timely whenever it came out. I read an early draft in November 2024, just after the election, and I even remember thinking, this is timely. But recalling the concerns that arose prior to the start of the first Trump administration about stability of access to resources from the Obama administration absolutely did not prepare me for the landslide of changing access to resources from the Biden administration that started earlier this year. This landslide has been precipitated by a series of executive orders and other actions directing federal agencies to overturn their previous practices, including around diversity and inclusion, the climate crisis, public health, and so much more. And these orders have had profound effects on people and communities in the United States and around the world. And they've also served as a tool of erasure. They direct agencies to change the words they use now. They also demand that agencies seek to change the words they used in the past, which tries to change some of the evidence of past government activity, and in a sense is an attempt to change that past itself. And of course, they can't change the past. We can't change the past. U.S. government information has never truly been unbiased and fully disinterested. But the digital environment that we live and work with today, it's possible that to kind of attempt to tweak some of the artifacts of this evidence here and there. And these changes are themselves evidence of government activity, which comes back around to why I'm so interested in public access to government information in the first place and why we need to work together on its preservation. So, as a librarian who focuses primarily on collections life cycle management, I am certainly familiar with preservation, but I tend to be thinking a little bit more about the what to preserve than the how to preserve it. And so I think with that in mind, I want to get this conversation started by digging into what it means to preserve government information. And I'm just starting out with a quote from software developer and social scientist Ed Summers, who currently happens to be a colleague of James's at Stanford University. Ed has said, if you are not providing meaningful access in the present to digital content, then you are not preserving it. So that brings me to my first question for discussion. Jim, what is the relationship between access and preservation? And I'd just like to hear for U.S. government information how it worked in the print era and how does or how should this work in the digital era?
Well, thank you. One of the definitions, there are lots of definitions of preservation. One of the definitions of preservation is access in the future. And in fact, we've always had access to government information. I mean, we could get information that was made public. In the paper era, the access infrastructure was libraries. And because libraries guaranteed long-term access, preservation was sort of a byproduct of the access infrastructure. But in the digital age, that's changed. The access infrastructure, which is the web, has no preservation byproduct the way the library infrastructure did in the paper era. In most cases, there's no guarantee, legal or procedural or policy-wise, for long-term access to digital government information. Access can be withdrawn at the flick of a button. It was for a long time that we've been. I should mention that this book is not one of those overnight books that we wrote last November. James and I have been writing about this for 20 years, and for a long time we were able to say we'd able to pinpoint small areas where something would get taken offline or something would be changed, and we'd identify those and say we need an infrastructure to keep this from happening. But mostly those were mistakes or aberrations. In this year, we've seen that it's not just the mistake or an aberration, but a government policy to erase and alter and remove information. That means that we really need a digital preservation infrastructure to complement the access infrastructure. And we don't have to start from scratch on that, is the good news. We've got lots of things in place. And James and I are not rocket scientists. We haven't come up with some cool technical solutions. We're just drawing on things that we've all seen and used every day. I want to close before I turn it back to you, Sherry, to say one of the other ways that we think about what preservation is in the digital age is to say that it has to have 5 guarantees. And those guarantees are not just that it's preserved, but discoverable. Not just that it's discoverable, but deliverable. Not just that it's deliverable as bits, but it's readable. Not just that it's readable, but it's understandable. And not just that it's understandable, but it's usable. And with that, I'll stop.
And I just put something in the chat about an ALA, American Library Association publication from the 1980s and 90s called Less Access to Less Information by and About the U.S. Government. So librarians have been documenting access or lack of access to government information for many, many years. And Jim and I had this series digitized, and it's now freely available on our website.
You know, what you're all saying makes a lot of sense and really lines up with my experience working with why do we do this work. And I think that, Jim, your sort of hierarchy of everything that preserved government information needs to be also speaks to some of the incentive structure around doing this work, right? Because if we preserve things and nobody ever touches it or uses it, how is that preservation? How does that actually, advance these particular interests? And I think too that having a greater understanding of the technology side of how it is that digital content is captured and preserved can kind of help to elucidate why this relationship is in place. So why is it not enough just to say that, well, these bits and bytes are still out there somewhere? So I'm just wondering if you have any kind of reaction to the underlying why behind this way of thinking about preservation.
Well, I have two things.
Always.
Always two things. One thing is that government information is valuable for a number of reasons. Some of it's valuable because it documents the activities of government and makes government accountable. But another thing is that government information is valuable because it's irreplaceable. Government collects a lot of information. It collects information from states. It does scientific surveys. It creates information by funding science. It collects information with censuses. It does GIS location. And that information, if we lose it, can't be recollected. You can't find out what the population of a city was in 1950 in 2025. You have to record that information and keep it safe. The second thing is that we talk about this in the book just briefly, that having the information preserved is important because the information has value. But the information really only has value if it's usable. It needs a use value as well as an intrinsic value. And we use the example of a tractor. You can have a very expensive tractor locked in a barn, but if the barn never gets unlocked and goes out into a field, you really haven't made use of the tractor. And the same is true of information.
And I think the piece that I've always been interested in that Jim hinted at is that the idea of control, all of the use of government information, access to government information, all of this can't be done unless you control that information. And that's one of the things that I think has sort of maybe gone away from the frontal lobes of many librarians with the internet age, and many in the public who think once it's published, once it's on the internet, then it's there forever. Thank you for the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine, but that's not always the case. And we need to actually collect that information in order to do all of the other things, including preservation and access, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But control of the information, I think, is one of the keys.
Right. And just a conceptual underpinning of collecting information is itself really huge. But so I guess I want to next kind of move to one particular tactic for collecting government information, which is web harvesting. So can you give us a high-level overview of web harvesting for U.S. government information and who does what? Why do they do it? And I think there are some gaps. What are some of these gaps?
Yeah. I can handle that one, Jim. So web harvesting of the federal domain has been happening since the Internet Archive brought the Wayback Machine online in 1996, which may have been pre-internet or just when like Gopher switched over to internet, regular internet. But more concerted efforts began in 2004 and expanded with the inception of the End of Term Archive in 2008. End of Term Archive seeks to harvest the entire .gov.mil federal web domain every 4 years at the end of or end and beginning of each presidential term, hence the name End of Term. There have been many smaller and more targeted projects from organizations like the Library of Congress, the National Archives and Records Administration, the Government Publishing Office, as well as individual libraries through programs like Archivit subscription service. Again, an Internet Archive service. Thank you. One that I use very, very often. And lastly, there's been serendipitous web harvesting of individual URLs via things like Internet Archive's Save Page Now tool, which I'm sure everyone has bookmarked on their browser, right? Right? It's something that I use almost on a daily basis when I answer a reference question or a research consult, and I find an answer on the federal web domain. I always save that page so that I know that I can get back to it later in case things change or get deleted. So I like to describe what's happening in terms of web harvesting as in a water metaphor, I guess. So there are drips, and there are pools, and there are oceans of web harvesting going on. But despite all of these activities, thanks, Chris, for putting the Save Page Now in there. Despite all of these activities, it's difficult to know the content gaps, since we really don't have, as I mentioned earlier, we don't really have a denominator of the entire scope of the federal government information that's published on the web. There are some known gaps. For example, web and mapping apps that display data or need to be queried or need to have a human input in order to, change the display or query a database. Those kinds of web tools that have become de rigueur in 2025 don't lend themselves to web harvesting via Heritrix or other sorts of web harvesters. There are projects that are underway. Some of the projects that are listed on the Data Rescue Project site are targeting these kinds of sites that don't lend themselves to traditional web harvesting. Do you have anything to add, Jay?
I should just add that we document the gaps in the book. One of the things that we discovered, which sort of surprised me, is that the judicial branch and the legislative branch are fairly well preserved. It's the executive branch, which is, of course, the biggest branch and by far the biggest publisher, which is very badly documented, preserved. The other piece that we found, which I didn't realize, was that the legislative branch is preserved over and over and over again in many different ways, not just with web harvesting and not just with the Internet Archive. So there's some inefficiency in the current system, which we could improve on. We have the models.
Well, I'm really glad. And James, you briefly mentioned the U.S. Government Publishing Office, the Library of Congress, National Archives and Records Administration. So these are all federal agencies that play a critical role in the current federal government information ecosystem. And, I think that one of the things that I've reflected on is that they each have their mission and their target areas that they are able to work in at their current capacities and with the technologies and relationships that they have in place. And so it's important to recognize that also, though, that I think there's been a perception in the past that, the government will take care of its own materials. And again, there are extremely hardworking folks in civil service who are working on efforts every single day. But we also have to acknowledge that there's different kinds of content and materials that just aren't being captured for reasons that you all go into in your book. So kind of moving us along a little bit, because we've been talking a little bit about this problem space, and of course we want to talk about solutions. There's a lot more that goes into digital preservation than just scooping everything up from the web and hoping for the best. So can you introduce the concept of a digital preservation infrastructure, as you mentioned earlier, and just share just a little bit about the characteristics and some of the assumptions that go into thinking about this infrastructure?
Yes. First of all, a lot of people think of when we use term infrastructure, people think of things like highways and railroad tracks and for transportation. And houses for housing infrastructure, and electrical infrastructure is the wires and cables and production of electricity. But we use a broader term that has been made popular in more recent years to mean the stuff that's built on top of that structure. And that means that it's made up not so much of hardware, but of social norms and common practices and principles and standards. It's kind of a soft thing, but it works when it works. And in fact, in our definition of infrastructure, when it's successful, it's invisible. You don't even know it's there until it breaks. And we've seen it break this year. In the paper era, the Federal Depository Library Program, the FDLP, which we've probably mentioned by acronym without spelling it out before, relied on the infrastructure of libraries. Libraries and their practices and functions. Nobody had to tell every library. There didn't have to be a law saying, you should have shelves and catalog your books and maybe have a reference desk. That was the way libraries worked. And in the paper era, it made sense to just send public documents to libraries to provide access in both short-term and long-term. Let me give you some examples of some elements, though, because you asked specifically about those. One of the elements of a digital preservation infrastructure is simply to have a goal of preserving government information. A lot of times our goals are to keep our institution healthy, or to crawl the web, or to make sure that FDLP survives. But digital preservation needs a goal of preserving information. And if our institutions are the best ones to do that, our institutions will survive. And if they're not, then they'll be replaced by other institutions. It's also not about tactics and tools. It's about we need the goal is the thing that we point toward, making sure that whatever it is we do with whatever tools ends up with the preservation of government information. Another element is to provide a way for libraries and archives to collaborate by fulfilling their traditional roles. As I mentioned earlier, government information covers everything from unique records that have never been published to common publications like the congressional record, to non-traditional in the paper era and now traditional in the digital era, information in databases and raw data files and so forth. In the past, archives collected those records and libraries collected publications, and it was kind of a clear-cut, mostly division of labor. But now those things are overlapping, both in how they're published and how they're preserved. But there's still a lot of differences. For instance, the National Archives only preserves about 1 to 3% of the records that agencies produce, whereas libraries have preserved closer to 100% of the published government information. So a DPI needs to harmonize those two things, make it so that libraries can keep doing what libraries do, archives can keep doing what archives do, but we'll have a big system that works for both. But the prime underlying element of a digital preservation infrastructure is to address the needs of users. That's the thing that allows us to decide, have we been successful or not? Not how many bits we preserved, not how many data centers we have, not how many files have been downloaded today, but are we addressing the needs of all users? And to do that, we need to challenge some of the assumptions from the paper era. One of those assumptions, I'll just give you a couple of examples, is the difference between availability and accessibility. Availability is binary. And information is either publicly available or it's not. Whereas accessibility can vary by degrees and different dimensions, such as discovery and identity and cost and how easy it is to use. Another assumption is the difference between information and information services. The web provides services that get at information, and our web harvesting mostly tries to preserve websites, but doesn't always get all the information behind the websites. And I'm guessing, I'm using myself as an example here, I don't really want to look at an old government website. I don't really care what it looked like. There are people who do, and we should address the needs of those people, but most people are looking for the information that those websites provided rather than what font did they use and what color and how trivial were the graphics that they used 10 years ago. So we need to start thinking about preserving information rather than preserving information services.
Yeah.
Well, and just to kind of dive into a little bit more focus here, one of the things that I know you said in the book is a successful DPI should focus as much on discovery and delivery as on storing. So, in the context of web archiving, there is a discovery and delivery gap. And that's something that I'm very curious about, especially because we're speaking here today with our friends at the Internet Archive. Can you just, in our last couple minutes before the audience Q&A, can you just say a little bit about that particular gap and maybe some solutions?
Yeah. So I I think there are some solutions starting to bubble up, and this sort of gets at what we've conceptualized as the digital preservation infrastructure. It's kind of layers of an onion, where you have preservation and access and discovery all happening in conjunction with each other. So I talked a bit about web archiving as a significant tool to preserve that information. Um, but web archiving is just the first necessary step of collecting content of importance. As Chris put it in the chat, preservation without access is just hoarding. So knowing that most people don't have the bandwidth or the technical skills to download and explore terabyte work files, end of term archives started in 2016 to do full text indexing of each of the end of term archives. You can get at that you can access that search at web.archive.org. They have a collection search for each of the end of term archives. We've also done some exploration of different kinds of content that we've collected over time. For example, we've extracted out all of the PDF files from end of term crawls and are making those full text searchable, with the understanding and the assumption that, a PDF file is more than likely to be a published document or a report, something that people are more interested in accessing, not, as Jim said, the 2004 version of the EPA website. And on that front, we've done some smaller pilot projects targeting other kinds of information. One example that I particularly love is a brainchild of Jefferson Bailey at the Internet Archive. And he made a collection called the Military Industrial PowerPoint Complex, which extracted out slide decks from the .mil web domain that we had harvested through end of term archive, and made that a standalone collection. I think that's a really beautiful thing and something that we can do more of. And so I want to expand on that and create other, what I like to think of as special collections. Um, and the first one that I really want to work on, and one that's the impetus of a lot of the data rescue projects that are happening now, is to create a data collection extracted from the archives of the 13 statistical agencies, as well as the Data Rescue Project and environmental public environmental data partners. Too many acronyms in my brain. To enhance and expand on the work of those organizations in regard to collecting and preserving government data and making it accessible for the long term.
I just want to add quickly that we quote in the book a survey of library leaders. And one of the questions and answers that came out of that survey was that people didn't understand how archived websites are used for discovery or how they're referenced. So this isn't just us saying, I don't know how to do it. There are other people who are finding the current way that we do things primitive. And I think that it's the case that once we have an infrastructure for digital preservation, we can rely on things being where they are, not moving or changing, having persistent addresses, will be able to develop new services, information services for that information that target specific communities. And those communities can be very large, like a city or a state for public libraries, or a large university, or very small, like a branch library or a community of people who are interested in military power plants.
Yes.
Well, that gives us all a lot to think about here. So thank you, Jim and James. And I want to go ahead and turn things back to Dave Hansen to begin the audience Q&A.
Thanks, y'all. That was really fantastic, and especially appreciate the discussion about discoverability. And I mean, I'm a librarian by training. I was a law librarian, actually. I still don't understand pseudocs. So
I could talk in pseudocs if you want, but the only one that would understand would be Sherry.
So this has been really, really great. So we have lots of questions, and I'm going to start off with a pretty heavy one that someone asked early on in the talk, which was about who has both the right and the responsibility of preserving and sharing government information. And the question is couched in terms of looking at what's happening with the federal government right now, kind of actively, seemingly rejecting the responsibility for preservation and permanent, unrestricted public access. And so, how do all the rest of us, I guess, kind of fit into that picture?
I can start on that. We go into some detail of the history of this. For a long time, librarians in particular have said that the government has a responsibility to preserve its own information. And for a variety of reasons, that has ended up leading to policies in libraries that had libraries not taking a responsibility. What we're suggesting in the book, based on our analysis of where we are today in the present, is that, and I'm not meaning that just in terms of the loss of information, erasure, and alteration of information that we're seeing today, but how much we're preserved and where the gaps already exist. Where we are today leads us to the conclusion that we need lots more people involved in preserving government information. James mentioned control, and this is one of the main things that's happened in the shift to digital publishing. In the paper era, it was libraries reflecting the needs of their communities that were in control of what information got selected and kept and accessible over the long term. In the digital shift, where we rely on government agencies to do it, we're at the mercy of those government agencies making the same decisions that we do locally. And we've seen cases which is not unusual, where the agency's own understanding of its own information and who uses it and how is different from the people who actually want to use the information. The one other piece, and then I'll stop, is that if we rely only on the government, we tend to rely on the structure of government to find information and use information. And information usually does not respect boundaries of agencies or branches. So if you're looking for economic information, you certainly want to go to the executive branch, but you also need to find what legislation is affecting the information that's being collected. And you need to look at judicial decisions that have challenged collection of information, collection of different kinds of information and how it's done. So it's important to get more people involved. By that, I mean more libraries speaking for their communities. And by communities, I mean designated communities, which have specific types of needs and specific ways that they look for, find, acquire, and use that information.
Yeah. And I would just, to jump in on that, I think it's really important that it's important to know that the federal government information is in the public domain. And I think it's really important, critical really, to feed the public domain, to not take information out of the public domain and make it commercial, because that doesn't help anybody, that doesn't help the public access or preserve government information. So the beauty of the FDLP, the Federal Depository Library Program, is that it took publications from government and organized them for local communities and made them publicly accessible. It fed the public domain, and it continues to feed the public domain. So I think anything going forward that doesn't feed the public domain, I think is not it's not going to be sustainable for the long term, for sure, but it's also not going to be helpful for the public. One example of that always blew my mind, the Congressional Research Service, the CRS, is basically the think tank for Congress. They're a unit within the Library of Congress, and basically anytime a congressperson wants to do any research, they ask CRS to do research. They've been around since, I think, 1906, early 1900s. For a long time, the CRS, they published these reports and they sent reports to Congress people. They didn't preserve their own reports. And so for many, many years, they have subscribed to a commercial service, LexisNexis and now ProQuest, which had the foresight to collect those reports as they were being published and put them online in a commercial database. So it was only a few years ago that Congress finally had the sense to pass a law that required the Library of Congress to make CRS reports publicly available. And so that's a really beautiful thing, and we need to do more of that.
I love me some CRS reports.
Right.
So we have another question. It asked broadly about what about archiving podcasts and videos? I want to expand on that a little bit. I mean, one of the things that we see increasingly from government agencies is that they're communicating via commercial platforms, right? So they're using Instagram and all these other kind of methods of getting information out. And that adds, it seems to me, a complicated twist, because not only is that information in a wide diversity of places that maybe is difficult to track, but also you've got to deal with the terms of service of those platforms. So could you talk a little bit about how preservation of government information on those commercial platforms works, or what the challenges are?
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges. You mind if I start, Jim? I'm sure you have ideas too. Um, with end of term archive, we had a lot of issues with collecting Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. This time around, we did collect a lot of YouTube videos of official government accounts, and those are in the Wayback Machine, and available in that way. But you're right. Using government officials using commercial social media platforms to get the word out is particularly tricky. A few months ago, I had a talk with Daniel Schumann, who works in sort of government transparency and open government in Washington, D.C. And I had the idea of passing a law to make any official channel of any government politician or government agency that uses those social media platforms, that those accounts would have to be preserved in the National Archives or some other place, so that they would be collected and preserved and made accessible for the long term. But as of now, it's really tricky. Twitter's a little easier. Facebook, they're sort of a walled garden, and they don't really want other services or other entities to have access to that information that they're collecting and using for various means.
I want to add two things very quickly. One is there's an appendix in the book on significant properties of digital information, which addresses your original question, Dave, about how do you archive things that are not just text? It's a complex issue, and we address it cursorily, but we at least outline the issue. The second thing is that, again, getting to the idea that somebody other than the government needs to preserve government information, the government is sometimes prohibited or unable, just through policy and budgeting, to archive information that they don't start with, that they don't control. So by having libraries and archives outside the government involved in selecting information, there's a broader scope of what we can select and what we can acquire and how we can preserve it. And by involving a lot of people, we can have collections that focus on specific kinds of problems, like podcasts. You could have a podcast collection that is able to figure out what's the best way to collect a podcast, and what do we need, and do we have transcripts, and all the other associated questions. And I'll stop there.
And I'll
Thanks.
just jump one last thing, which
Yeah.
is just there's always going to be gaps. And our questions really are, where can we focus our efforts, and where's the best place to invest resources to start to make sure that we're looking at what is going to be needed for the future.
Thank you. We have so many good questions. Someone just asked about Signal, and I really want to ask about government use of Signal. But I'm going to ask you a different question because I think I have one that's kind of good to end on, which is basically, what can we do? What can people, who are on this call, what can librarians do? I think there's another piece of a question here that someone asked about, what can government workers do to facilitate preservation of government information. So I'll turn that over to you, and that, I think, will be our last one.
Oh, there's so many things. Let me mention a few things very quickly because I know we're running out of time. The first thing that we as an interested community need to do is recognize that there's a problem and start by addressing that problem collectively. We can't wait for somebody else to do it. I saw a t-shirt the other day that said, somebody should do something. Well, the somebody is us. We really need to do something now. Second thing is, for a long time, libraries and archives have relied on the government to preserve its own information. It's time for us to say, what can the government only do in the digital preservation infrastructure? And what the government can do best, and in some cases only, is to make sure that the digital objects that they produce are preservable and that they are well described with metadata. We need the government to concentrate on what it can do and not ask it to do things that it's neither legislatively mandated nor funded to do. I saw a report, I forget whether we cited it in the book, I think it's an ALA report that outlined the number of skills needed to do digital preservation, and I think it was 35 skills. Well, no organization, no library, no archive has 35 people, or even 17 people with 35 skills. But by spreading out the load of preservation across many institutions, a library with only one or two people might have a very important skill and be able to apply that skill if there's a goal with strategies in place and they know what they can do. And give you a very quick example, there are lots of bibliographies that libraries do, LibGuides that list government information. But that information, they're just lists. Wouldn't it be nice if the work that went into those, which is done by subject specialists, could ensure that those documents that they have found were well described and preserved with a permanent ID? There's one last thing. If you think of two libraries, say you think of a children's library and a medical library, what's different about those two libraries? What makes one a children's library and the other a medical library? It's their collections, the things they've selected for their community, and the services they provide to that community for those collections. We need libraries involved in doing that for government information. That means there's lots of room. And I said that was the final thing, but I have to end on a different one. Now you're wanting to. The final thing is that we need to start. There's lots of room for advocacy. You're not a technical person. There's lots of room for figuring things out, getting people organized, advocating positions, advocating changes in government policy, advocating changes within the library community, within library organizations and individual institutions. So there's something for everybody to do.
Yeah. And I think that's if we build the DPI in the way that Jim and I envision, there will be a piece for even the public to do. And an example of that actually happening now is two examples. Always two examples, right? The End of Term Archive accepts seed nominations, so nominations of websites to the project to make sure that the pages, the government domains that people are interested in or think are critical for preservation are nominated and then get into our processes to collect them. That's a one example of a public helping with an infrastructure. The other example is that in the broad data rescue umbrella with Data Rescue Project and Public Environmental Data Partners, et cetera. There's a Reddit community called Data Hoarders. And those data hoarders, I think it's like 200,000 people in this Reddit channel. And early on, a bunch of those people jumped on the bandwagon to collect and preserve government data. And so, those folks, they're random people with random usernames that I don't know 200,000 people. But they collected all this stuff and did things like put data up on BitTorrent sites and things like that. So I think there's lots of room for lots of public input and public activity in the future digital public infrastructure.
All right. Thank you all so much. We could have gone on for, I think, like another hour. This was so fascinating, but I need to turn it over to Chris. I'm sorry, Chris. I probably should have turned it over to you like 5 minutes ago, but this was so interesting.
Yeah, thank you all.
Yeah, no, this is a fascinating conversation. I would like to go on for another hour, and I mean, to the fact that we have 119 people who are still here means that we probably could. So maybe let's do another session, right? Let's have a part 2 to this. So what I'd love for everyone to do is to be sure to grab your copy of Preserving Government Information. Again, you can download it, read it for free. You can also purchase it in print if that's the way you want to read it or consume it and hold on to it over time. It's a great book, fascinating authors as you've seen here today. So to close down here, I'd like to wrap, as we always do, with the commitments and thank yous. Today's session was recorded. We're sharing the links out. We'll be putting the whole video up on archive.org tonight. And tomorrow, all registrants will receive an email with a link to the recording. For thank yous, a big thank you to James and to Jim and Sherry for a fascinating conversation today, and to Dave Hansen and Authors Alliance, as always. Thank you for facilitating and co-hosting our sessions, and to you, our audience. Thank you for your time and your attention and your enthusiasm for coming to these sessions and listening in and coming with such great questions. And to sign off here, I hope that you can join us at one of our upcoming events. Thanks all. Have a great day.